who are in the Eastern, Central, and Mountain time zones. And a very good morning to those in the Pacific time, including those in Alaska and in Hawaii. Thank you very much for taking an hour from your busy schedule and joining our webinar today. My name is Rathin Sinha. I am the moderator for today's webinar. I'll make the introductions and, time permitting, take questions and pass them to our presenters, Clinton Kelly, Senior Consultant and Biddle Consulting Group, and Jason Schaefer, Senior Consultant, same Biddle Consulting Group. Today's webinar is being hosted by Jobfindah Network. Employers across the country use Jobfindah for easy to use and cost-effective job posting, distribution, marketing, and technology solutions to power their recruitment, diversity, and federal contractor web-specific compliance, as well as for customized marketing and technology solutions to enhance employer brand and recruiting effectiveness. Online recruitment and compliance are dynamic fields, and the industry is evolving at a faster pace than ever before. Collective learning and community participation are of paramount importance. So today's webinar is not going to be a sales pitch of any product and solution. Instead, it is going to be an informative discussion of issues facing many of us. Our topic today is a timely one. It is imperative that recruiters and hiring managers eliminate any form of bias or perceived discrimination in the hiring process. This implies that any sort of minimum requirements for a job or testing in the hiring process must withstand scrutiny by the regulatory bodies such as the OFCCP. We are very fortunate to have not one, but two presenters who are highly experienced consultants in this specialized area to speak before us today. Our presenter, Clinton Kelly, PhD, is a senior consultant with the Biddle Consulting Group. He has more than 10 years of experience working in the areas of job analysis, test development, and test validation services. He has worked with clients in both government and the private sector to develop and validate a variety of employee selection devices, such as written tests, work samples, interviews, and more. Our other presenter, Jason Schaefer, MBA, is also a senior consultant with the Biddle Consulting Group. He too has more than 10 years of experience developing and validating assessments used for employee selection. His work includes designing and administering job analysis, conducting standard-setting studies, writing technical reports. Additionally, he also works developing of surveys, assessing employee attitudes, organizational climate, client satisfaction, program or process effectiveness, and 360-degree feedback for leadership development. Now, some housekeeping information. All participants are muted, so please use the chat box at the bottom of your screen to communicate with us. I'll also request you to mute your audio, especially if you are in a crowded room using a mobile device or driving. As I mentioned, if you cannot hear through your computer, there is a call-in number. I have sent that in the chat box, but the call-in number is 1-917-338-1451, and your PIN number is 591699 $. Once again, 1-917-338-1451. Your participant PIN number is 591699. 99 $. We'll have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Please send your questions through our moderated chat room or email me directly at rathim.sinha@jobfindah.com. We will answer them, some at the end of the webinar and the remainder as a follow-up. Finally, with technology such as this that connects us across the country, there is always a possibility for someone getting disconnected. If so, please dial in again. All three of us, Clinton, Jason, and I, have the ability to cover for each other if network issues come up. So please stay with us, even if we are disconnected momentarily. We'll also make a copy of the presentation as well as recording of the event available after the webinar. Please note that unfortunately, HRCI or SHRM credits are not available for this webinar. We will try to obviously make that available in the next one. Now, without further ado, let me give the controls to Clinton and Jason.
Thank you for the introduction. We're happy to be with you here today and to speak on this topic.
Yes, hello.
So to give a little overview of the agenda for today's webinar, we're going to go over the Internet Applicant Rule and how that relates to BQs or Basic Qualifications. So throughout the webinar, we may say, if we're saying BQs, just know we are referring to Basic Qualifications. We'll talk about periodically reviewing those basic qualifications and looking at a disparity analysis or adverse impact analysis, and then how to ensure that BQs are valid. And so we'll talk about how a development and validation method of BQs will actually show you how you can develop and validate BQs within your organization for specific positions. And then we'll just go over our summary and overall recommendations.
Yeah, and since we do have quite a bit of material to get through, and we want to make sure that we save enough time to actually show you how to develop defensible BQs, we'll probably move fairly quickly through the background material up until that point.
Yeah, and we have some background legal stuff up front that we'll go over, and then we'll keep it at a higher level, not to get too deep in the weeds there.
Yeah, it's just more to set the table, basically, of how everything fits together.
So first, a few key points about basic qualifications. Basic qualifications, they do make up the third prong of the four-prong definition of an Internet applicant. So first of all, an Internet applicant, someone is considered an applicant if they have submitted an expression of interest in the position, the employer has considered that individual for the position, and see the third one is the one that's most important to us today, is the individual who has expressed an interest in the position, they possess the basic qualifications for the job. And then lastly, that person has not self-selected or removed themselves from further consideration.
Yeah, some individuals will remove themselves actively or passively from your process, such as they'll decline an interview offer, they may not respond, they may not show up, they may have some falsifications on their application. So those people have removed themselves from your process, and therefore they're not defined as an Internet applicant.
And those are some key things to consider. We'll talk about briefly a little bit later as far as record keeping and how that can be beneficial for who and who is not an applicant as far as who you consider in your record keeping. But again, we're most concerned about that third point there is that the person who has expressed interest in the job, they meet the basic qualifications of the position.
Yeah, because once somebody's considered, you need to be able to, you got to be able to track that data. So. All right, so just an overall, here's an overview of basic qualifications in general about what they are and what they are not. They need to be identified in advance before you have anybody applying or showing interest in the job. And they're position specific. They're not just general and general company-wide. They have to be based on each specific position. They are pass-fail. They aren't rank ordered. So think of it as a hurdle that somebody has to pass. You either meet the basic qualification or you don't. Now I see here that we say that basic qualifications are not tests. And we mean that only to describe tests such as interviews or multiple choice tests but in reality, they are a test. They're a form of a test.
And we'll talk about that a little later in the presentation, but according to the Uniform Guidelines on Employee Selection Procedures, anytime you make a decision to exclude candidates from your candidate pool, to exclude them from consideration for a position, that is considered a test. So whether that be through basic qualifications, through an interview, through a multiple choice test, through screening of resumes, anytime you are actively removing people from your candidate pool, that is a test under the Uniform Guidelines.
Yep. I mean, ultimately what you're trying to do with the basic qualification is to make sure that the job seeker possesses the required knowledge, skills, and abilities at a level that is necessary to perform at a minimally competent level. That's what you're doing with basic qualifications.
And basic qualifications are not willingness questions. However, they often go hand in hand. We'll show you here in a slide or two. Typically, you'll see willingness questions administered at the same time as basic qualifications, and but they are different.
Yeah, actually, we have that example here. So this slide, we present some basic qualification examples on the left with some willingness question examples on the right, and you can take a look and see the difference. Typically, BQs are educational, their experience type statements. We see here that we have ability to lift as a basic qualification. That could be like a job in a warehouse, an accounting degree for an accounting type position. And then you see on the right-hand side, we have those willingness questions, whether somebody would be willing or not to work at a facility, you know, that may be outside of their local area. So there are some of the differences there.
And we talked about, again, we recommend, again, defining BQs and willingness questionnaires in advance and front-loading those BQs early in the hiring process, which most people already do. I'm assuming most of you already do that, so that people can self-select out of the process. Because if someone does not meet the BQ, they do not qualify as an applicant according to the Internet Applicant rule. And so that way, for counting, you want to know that up front, whether they meet or don't meet those basic qualifications, kind of right out of the gate. And again, you need to establish those ahead of time. You can't, after you get, say, for one position, you get 700 applications, say, wow, because we have so many applications, we're going to say you have to at least have a college degree to be considered, when in reality the BQ would be an associate's degree.
Yeah, you can't establish BQs after the fact once you've seen, oh, wow, we have a highly qualified group of candidates here. Let's raise the bar. That wouldn't be fair.
You have to set that ahead of time.
Yeah. All right, so here's some examples of basic versus desirable qualifications. So again, we're differentiating basic qualifications from desirable. We see here on the left side. So basic qualifications, it's the true minimum needed the first day on the job. Whereas a desirable qualification are characteristics that are nice. It'd be great if these candidates applying for the job had these qualifications. One issue that can come up from time to time is if you find that your hiring managers want to bring individuals in that do not meet the minimum qualifications, it could indicate that those minimum qualifications have been set too high. Conversely, if you find that they don't want to hire someone that meets the basic qualifications, it's possible that they were set too low.
Yeah. So just keep that in mind. If you're hearing from the hiring managers on a regular basis, one way or the other, none of these people who meet the basic qualifications are qualified. Or conversely, they're saying, I know someone who'd be great for this job, but they don't meet the basic qualifications. If you're hearing those on a regular basis, your BQs could need some modification.
All right, so this slide presents some three basic criteria for defensibility of basic qualifications. Again, we talked earlier about they need to be established in advance. But the first one here is that they're non-comparative. What we basically are saying here is we're not using the basic qualifications again to rank order candidates against one another. It's simply, do they possess the basic qualification or not? So it's a yes-no dichotomous decision, basically. They also need to be, second bullet point here, they need to be objective. And objective meaning that if somebody had the same level of technical expertise on the job as the contractor who's, say, doing the hiring here, the individual's doing the hiring, that they could look at the basic qualifications, compare it to the qualifications of an applicant and be able to decide objectively that the person met it or did not meet it.
A simple way of stating that is if we were to give another person our list of basic qualifications and our list of applicants, that they would reach the same conclusion as we did about who meets or does not meet those basic qualifications.
Yeah, consistently. A lot of, we all know that there are times where terminology or things aren't that well defined, and so it's a little fuzzy what someone means. And so BQs need to be written very crisply, clearly, objectively, so that, like I said, that somebody can actually evaluate a candidate and they can put them in the same category. You've either met it or you haven't met it. So third, basic qualifications need to be relevant to job performance for that particular position and consistent with business necessity.
Mm-hmm. For example, you could have a BQ for a job that says must have attended Disneyland 5 times within the last 2 years. That's non-comparative and objective, but it would not be relevant to job performance, I wouldn't think. So.
Yeah, and that third criteria, it is more complex, and it will be more the focus of this presentation. The method, again, we're going to say that towards the end about developing a solid BQ, defensible BQ process.
Some examples of non-comparative BQs that you see, and these are the most common ones that we see are minimum training, education, and experience requirements, like must have high school degree, a college degree, a certification in something, a certain license or certification, must have a valid Class C driver's license, weight handling requirements, the ability to lift a certain amount of weight.
We actually recently did a job analysis for an organization, validated a test, and they had some weight handling requirements because these individuals were truck drivers and they had to be able to lift materials and load them and unload them, et cetera.
Yeah, so we had to work them to make sure that the quantities, the amounts of weights were appropriate.
In terms of licenses, certifications, and other requirements, a good example would be construction jobs such as a plumber. In certain states, plumbers need to be licensed, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. And if done right, basic qualifications can reduce the size of the applicant pool, save time and money overall, reduce the time it takes to fill job openings, and also shows the applicants that, as an employer, you're serious about job standards. And they could potentially reduce injuries and or turnover. For example, if you are looking at certain physical requirements for a physical job, making sure that those you bring into the position are physically capable when they get onto the job so they don't get injured later on.
Yeah, some of the benefits, again, it's, you're eliminating non-qualified job seekers from your selection process, so you have less people being funneled through the process, and so you don't have to test them further or deal with them further, and so that saves you money. Also, you're making sure the people that ultimately make it through are more capable and qualified for the work that they're going to be doing. Now, if you develop BQs that are not job related and defensible, you do it improperly. You're putting a target on your back. Potentially as well, you're creating a situation where you may have indefensible disparities in your hiring rates based on protected group status.
For example, in a physically demanding job, that is likely to result in adverse impact against women when compared to men. So you would want to make sure, if you are creating those disparities in your hiring process, that it's a defensible disparity and not something that's indefensible.
Yeah, you don't want to be screening out people who could have done the work. And so if you are screening out people in protected classes or people that could have done the work and it's not job related, it's not valid, it's considered discrimination. And that could be very, very costly in multiple ways to a company. So this slide, speaking about 503 VEBRA, is basically just driving home the point even further that the BQs need to be job related for the position and consistent with business necessity, especially if, again, we're screening out individuals that may have a disability. It's prohibited that federal contractors or subcontractors discriminate in employment against people with disabilities. So if those people are being screened out at a higher rate, it must be a defensible reason why.
And one of the key parts is this last underlined section here, to be able to show that it's job related and consistent with business necessity. That language comes directly from the Federal Uniform Guidelines on Employee Selection Procedures. And that language is what triggers the requirement for validation.
Yeah, and so for us, for example, with the previous example about being able to lift weight as a person who drives trucks and delivers packages and whatnot, you need to make sure that, you know, if the applicant can perform the essential functions of the job with or without a reasonable accommodation, that they're not being unfairly discriminated against by the BQ.
So this gives a written description of how, I guess, an unlawful employment practice would be determined that it's unlawful. We're gonna go ahead, and you'll have this here written because you have access to the presentation. We're gonna go ahead and skip to the next slide, which shows a graph, a flow chart.
Kind of a flow chart on how this actually is carried out in reality.
Yeah. So you have a practice, procedure, or test. In this case, because we're talking about BQs, we'll say you have a BQ. You have a basic qualification. And what we look at, the first question is, does your basic qualification result in differential rates of people passing? If no, if you say we have the same rates of minorities, non-minorities, males, females that pass our BQ, there is no requirement to demonstrate the job relatedness of your BQ. Although it's still a good idea, there is no legal requirement to do so if you have no differential hiring rates, passing rates in your BQ. If you look at our BQ and say our BQ results in we select more males than females based on the BQ, then that triggers the burden to demonstrate the validity of your BQ. So we're going to say, is the BQ valid? Yes or no? No, the plaintiff prevails, they win. If it is valid, then they look at, okay, the last step here is your BQ reasonable? Is there another alternative employment practice or another alternative BQ that you could use that would result in less adverse impact? If yes, the plaintiff wins. If no, the defendant prevails.
And when we talk about alternative employment practice with regard to BQs, we'll talk later, but the process that we're going to talk about in terms of developing and validating them allows for that differentiation in levels. Because you want to select the BQ that is best, but that will also result in the least amount of adverse impact. So if there's several similar BQs that you could select, they're very similar in their ratings and what they're assessing, you're going to want to pick the one that results in less adverse impact when you can. That way you can prevail if it ever made it to this point here, number 3. On this.
Yeah.
All right, so this is some more basic qualifications, some attributes under the 503 BEVRA. And so one of the key things here is that there's a periodic review that needs to be carried out of your BQs. And the scheduling must be included in your AAP. And there hasn't been typically a set time limit for when that has to happen, but one of the key things here that we got to take away from this is that we need to evaluate your BQs just like a test for adverse impact. So you want to see if the hiring rates, the people that pass or fail your BQ rates, are there discrepancies based on protected class status, such as male, female, and the various ethnicities and whatnot.
And if so, have you done the work to demonstrate that they are job-related and consistent with business necessity?
Now, one of the key points from the slide takeaways, and we'll talk about it further, is that you absolutely have to have an ADA-compliant job analysis on file for the position. That provides the foundation for a bunch of the analyses that need to be done to be compliant with 503 and BEVRA.
And as Jason was stating a minute ago, when it comes to the periodic review, there is no specifically stipulated timeline as far as how often you need to periodically review your BQs. However, in our industry, when you do, say, job analysis work, which BQs would kind of fall under that same umbrella, I would believe, a rule of thumb is generally 5 years, or whenever the job has significantly changed. So if it has significantly changed, then you want to review it. But you can go and periodically just ask your hiring managers if you validated your BQs, maybe a couple years down the road, hey, here's our BQs, take a look, has anything changed in the job, is this BQ still relevant, and just document that kind of update process.
Yep. An example would be you're sending your BQs out to the hiring managers and you're asking them if anything needs to be updated.
So as we have already kind of talked about some disparity analysis, we'll get into disparate impact. So when we talk about disparate impact, if you're not familiar with it, disparate impact is any time you have a significant difference in hiring rates or passing rates on a test between in gender, ethnicity, age groups, in any of the protected classes. And as a rule of thumb, the general difference is we talk about the 4/5 rule. So we'll look at the 4/5 rule on the next slide. But you want to track your adverse impact along each step of your selection process so you know exactly where the adverse impact is or is not occurring. Because if you don't, if you just look at the overall, you open yourself up to scrutiny for each of your selection process. Say you have a BQ, you have a written test, you have a hiring interview. If you don't track your stats for each of those different steps, the OFCCP or some auditing agency can come in and make it evaluate and audit each of your selection practices and not just the one that's resulting in adverse impact.
All right, this slide just presents an example of adverse impact, basically selection rates, in this case by gender. So, for example, in a firefighter job, there may be a part of the work sample test where they're having to drag a dummy, 100 feet. You may find that more males than females can pass that just based on their physical strength. Keep in mind, it's not intent. So we're not trying to discriminate against females or any protected classes here, but based on the test, sometimes there are differences in scores. So the intent is not required for there to be discrimination. Discrimination occurs when you don't have validation evidence to back up your procedures.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there's a discrepancy in hiring rates or passing rates.
Yeah, and just so you know, when disparate impact is the rule of thumb and not is the rule and not the exception, most hiring practices will result in some type of adverse impact against some protected group at some point in time. If you don't have it this year, you might have it next year. So that's why adverse impact itself doesn't mean you're doing things bad. It just means you need to make sure what you're doing is job related and consistent with business necessity.
Yep, and for this slide, basically the key takeaway here, this is kind of an overview of the selection process requirements. You definitely want to make sure that you have records for everyone who took and passed and failed the BQ screening process so that you can evaluate your BQs for adverse impact.
So this just shows that 80% rule we were mentioning, where you can see that here we had 50% of men passing our BQ and 25% of women. And this results against adverse impact according to the 4/5 or 80% rule that you can find in the Federal Uniform Guidelines, which is meant to be a rule of thumb. And so, again, this just triggers the requirement to show the job relatedness and business necessity of your BQ when you see the differences like we see here.
All right, for this slide, basically the overall end result, so this is the Fisher exact test statistical analysis of adverse impact. But the key point, the key takeaway here is it looks like the basic qualification is producing the highest rate of differences between males and females here. One key takeaway, though, is at the end result, let's say when the hiring is actually completed, you had no adverse impact and there was a 0 SV right there at the end, you'd still have to evaluate and prove the validity of your BQ because you did have adverse impact at that step. Even if later steps that adverse impact has been sort of erased by a reversal, you still need to validate and support the use of that procedure that resulted in adverse impact at an earlier step.
Our point with this was just to drive home the point that just because you don't have adverse impact in the final selection doesn't mean you won't have it in the earlier parts of your selection process, and those need to be evaluated as well.
All right, so we do again want to just remind you that, it's not intentional, and usually it's not the fault of anyone in particular. It's not ideal, but most tests practices, procedures, and whatnot, they have adverse impact against some group, and that's why it's important that you base your tests and procedures on a job analysis, an ADA compliant job analysis, and then you periodically review and evaluate your adverse impact numbers as well as the content of your selection procedures. So significant disparity, as we've already mentioned, having adverse impact does not equal discrimination. It only equals discrimination if you can't demonstrate the job relatedness and business necessity. Yeah, but as we spoke about earlier, you definitely need to track results by each step in your selection process.
So that way, yeah. So now we're going to get into more of how do you actually validate your BQs. So let's say you've got your BQs, they have some adverse impact, and even if they don't, you still want to validate your BQs because just like I said, just because you don't have adverse impact, say this recruitment cycle with your BQ, next recruitment cycle you might have adverse impact against a protected group. So you want to validate your BQs. So it is a more stringent requirement than the job relatedness. It gets to the requirement like we were mentioning throughout this presentation to show the job related business necessity.
Yeah, and one way to think about it is at the core of the acceptable methods for validating the BQ is showing a clear linkage or connection that traces the BQ back to the essential requirements of the job. I mean, if you can do that, and usually that requires that ADA compliant job analysis, if you can do that, you're in the clear for the most part.
And just to show you that these things do matter, one of the critical court cases that is cited in this area a lot is Griggs versus Duke Power. And this was a case that was significant in the development of the Federal Uniform Guidelines on Employee Selection Procedures. Duke Power here required a high school diploma, so they had a BQ here of a high school diploma for hired paid jobs within the company. That resulted in adverse impact. So there was adverse impact against blacks or African Americans, but there was no apparent discriminatory intent. However, they could not demonstrate that the high school diploma was directly related to the work being performed on the job. So they could not demonstrate the job relatedness of the high school diploma, and so they lost that case there. Their BQ was found, they could not defend it. They could not defend their BQ.
Now, in terms of validity, how do we define validity? Textbook-wise, it's simply, hey, we want to make sure that what we're measuring is what we intend to measure. Is the measurement what the test was designed to measure? But in a legal sense, it's evidence that supports whether or not the procedure is job-related and consistent with business necessity. So in a legal realm, it's that aspect that we focus on. So there are two primary types of validation evidence. The first is content validity. These are two primary types often used in employee selection test development and validation. There are others, but these are the primary two. First one is content validity. Basically, we want to make sure the content of the selection procedure matches the content of the job. The second is criterion validity, and this is a statistical evaluation of test scores and later job performance, and it's usually reported as a correlation. And we use that type of validation when the content of the procedure, say it could be a personality test, is more abstract and less of a natural match with the actual content of the job, where you're actually validating constructs underneath the measure with future job performance.
And because employers, you typically only hire those people who pass those applicants who pass the BQs. Usually criterion-related validity is not used for validating BQs. So what we're going to show you is a content validity strategy for how you can validate BQs.
So why validate? I mean, we've been talking quite a bit about the legal aspect of it, but there's more to validation than just legal. You want to make sure that, hey, if you're going to test people, the goal is to select the most qualified candidates for the job, right? Because you're going to reduce the amount of time you spend training them, dealing with issues, potential legal actions in the future, certainly in the legal sense of validation, but also in terms of their job performance. If they create issues that cost the company money, put them in a legal situation with liability.
Now some positions, the establishing BQs can be fairly straightforward. For example, let's just say we give a couple examples for health or medical profession jobs, like a doctor, for example. Usually it's pretty clear to be a doctor, you have to have a medical degree. So that's usually a BQ is a medical degree. And not many people are going to argue that. Or say a professor at a university is typically going to require a master's or PhD degree in that field. However, for other positions, developing BQs is a little more complex. In some of the technical professions or supervisory roles or skilled trade crafts or for labor positions. So, like I said, it's sometimes it's clear cut and other times it's not.
Now this slide just presents a high-level overview of the BQ development and validation process. And everything starts with that job analysis. That is that fundamental foundation for a lot of the work that we all do in employee selection. We're going to talk a little bit further about this in the coming slides. But at that point, You would identify potential BQs. You would write multiple levels of each one. They call this bracketing, where you write 4 to 9 different levels of each BQ requirement. And we'll explain why you want to do that a little bit later. You want to get job experts involved, roughly 7 to 10, review and rate each of the BQs. And then you're going to set a statistical agreement of 70% or more level for job experts to agree to a given level of a BQ, and then that you can adopt that BQ into your selection process. And then you're going to report all this in a report. Now, I know we're kind of moving a little quickly through here because we're going to talk about it in later slides. This right here, this slide talks about the 6 primary steps in a job analysis, basically. So this is some fundamentals regarding job analysis. You can see here it begins with developing duties and knowledge, skills, and abilities, collecting data from job experts, and then writing up a report as well. So, but the key thing from here is we want to isolate those critical knowledge, skills, and abilities that will be used to develop BQs. Because remember, a BQ, what it does is it's some sort of past history of the applicant that can demonstrate that they have that relevant knowledge, skill, or ability at the required level to perform minimally competently.
So in doing this analysis of the job, like Jason just mentioned, it helps us link the BQ back to the duties on the job. So we can see, like if we set a BQ, for example, of must have a plumber's, must be have a journeyman plumber license from the state. We can look back and say, well, why do we require this? Because on the job you need to perform these duties, you need to possess these knowledge, skills, and abilities, and you're going to get that through becoming a licensed plumber with the state.
Yep.
So the next you're going to identify these potential BQs, and you're going to look at, are there certain vocational or technical degrees, major areas of study. This link right here is to a useful, it's a little older, but it's from the U.S. Department of Education, and it gives specific areas of study. So you want to say, if you are going to say a bachelor's degree, is it a bachelor's degree in anything? Is it a bachelor's degree in engineering? And what kind of engineering? So get as specific as you can while still, I guess, as specific as you need to be for your particular position. Again, looking at the years of experience or physical requirements. So these are all potential BQs that you can write.
Yeah, one of the things to keep in mind too is the reason that we write 4 to 9 levels of BQ is you don't want to just put one thing in front of job experts, because we don't want them to just bless the one thing put in front of them if they would have come up with something totally different had they started from scratch on their own. And that's why we come up with 4 to 9 different gradations of each BQ, because it allows job experts to review that and select the one that's the best fit.
And we'll show you some examples here. This slide, we know you can't read it. It's just to show you that a form that we have, and we're going to kind of zoom in on this form on the next slide, but a form that we have for helping to create BQs. And what it is on the top here is you list different levels of experience. It says no experience needed here, and all the way up to 5 years of experience in, and you can kind of, it's a way for helping to develop BQs initially. And down the left here, we have completion of certain degrees. So it's a way for targeting, here's high school diploma. So you could say, okay, for this job, we're thinking a tentative BQ might be high school diploma and 5 years of relevant job experience. So this is a list for you to kind of developing those tentative 4 to 9 brackets of BQs that Jason was mentioning.
So we have some example levels of potential BQs here. So at level 1, we go all the way down to level 1, and that's a bachelor's degree in statistics, business, or psychology, or HR. And as you move up, it changes. So there's not only the educational requirement there, but some experience required. And then you move up, and it's even more experience level as well. And so as you see, these are similar, but they just, as they go to the level 4, it becomes much more intense. So these are 4 levels of some potential BQs.
Yeah. So these are some examples that you can look at. Yeah.
Right now, what we have here is a BQ development survey form and validation form. And we're going to actually talk about each of the fields in this form in more detail on the remaining slides. But this form would be, hey, this is one potential form that could be used to help validate some BQs. So you could develop and validate BQs from scratch, or you could take your existing BQs and evaluate them as well using this type of form.
Yeah. So what you're first going to do is you're going to have your BQ description right here. So for simplicity's sake, let's just say it is high school degree, the first one. Then below that you have associate's degree, then bachelor's degree. So you're going to list your BQs here on this description area right here. And then we want to ask what KSAs, and that's knowledge, skills, or abilities, which knowledge, skills, or abilities are linked to this BQ. So in other words, if you're going to have a high school degree, what knowledge, skills, and abilities are linked back to that degree? And you should have that from your job analysis.
Yeah, so basically that's, again, why it's fundamental that a job analysis has been performed. What you're looking for is, does that BQ provide relevant skill, training, experience in that knowledge, skill, or ability? That linkage is what we're trying to draw here.
Mm-hmm. And then we have a yes or no question here. Is the BQ based on a clear resemblance between the specific behaviors, products, and KSAs required on the job? So possessing this BQ, is there a clear resemblance between possessing this BQ and then the KSAs and things that you're going to need to perform on the job? So yes or no?
And on this one, what we're getting at here is we talked earlier about BQs need to be objective, and so we have that in smaller font here, smaller print, that definition about somebody who has your technical knowledge, would they be able to evaluate whether an applicant had the qualification, met the qualification or not. So you can indicate yes or no, and then we also want to make sure that the BQ is at the right level given the first day on the job, because most of what we do in testing is we can only test for things required of applicants needed day one walking into the job prior to training. Mm-hmm. And
again, we want to make sure our BQ isn't too high or too low, it's just right. So I call this kind of the Goldilocks scale, you know, the porridge isn't too hot, too cold, it's just right. So you want your BQs to be at that level as well, the just right level. Lastly, you also want to, will the BQ be easily understood by applicants? This is important because if you're posting your BQs early on in the process, you want candidates to be able to determine, should I continue or should I self-select out? You don't want people because, I don't know what that BQ means, I'm not going to apply for this job. You may be losing qualified candidates, diverse applicants. However, on the other hand, you also want people to say, if you say must possess a bachelor's degree in accounting, that's pretty straightforward. People should easily be able to know if they possess or do not possess that BQ.
Yeah, and the second question on this slide, we just want to make sure, again, that we're comparing people against the qualification and not one another. So does this BQ differentiate whether someone possesses or does not possess the BQ? Not that it's being used to differentiate candidate versus candidate.
Mm-hmm. This is what we're showing you, the scale. This scale right here that we pulled, it's from an article that we referenced on the end of the slide that was used by a state agency to establish BQs and was found legally defensible in the courts, and this is a scale that they had used. So we just want to show you that there are, I guess, other scales, that the scales that we are showing you aren't the be-all, end-all. There are multiple ways to do things correctly in many instances, and this is just another scale that was used.
It's another good example.
Yeah.
All right, so when it's all said and done, you're going to have collected ratings from your job experts on each level of the minimum or the basic qualifications. And what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to select a point where.
So let's say this first one here, where 100% of job experts agree. Again, for simplicity's sake, we'll say it's high school degree.
That's the lowest level, right?
Yeah.
So if you order your basic qualification brackets from low to high, and so 100% have said yes to all questions, right? Because it was the easiest one. Right?
Let's say it's an accounting job. So we say high school degree. 100% of experts said yes. You need to basically. They all agreed that it met all these criteria for basic qualification. However, they probably said, well, the BQ. They probably said it's too low. Let's say the next one is associate's degree in accounting.
So yeah, it's getting more relevant, but you've lost some people because they're not saying yes to all questions.
Yeah. And let's say the last one here is bachelor's degree in accounting.
Yeah, and 3 years of experience, let's say.
Yeah.
And so in that case, we've actually lost some people. So we're no longer we're not above 70 anymore. We're below 70, and so we want to move back up a notch, go back to one that's a little bit easier.
So in this particular instance, we would set the BQ as an associate's degree in accounting, if that were using our example. You would go back to the one where at least 70% of job experts agreed that the BQ agreed with the BQ. So here we drop below the 70, we get 60. So that's again, we provide a simple example here, but you can see it's not, once you get everything set up, it's not too difficult to create this table, to ask some people to respond to this, to get your 7 or so job experts to respond to this BQ survey, and to see where the results fall.
This slide just presents information based on the Uniform Guidelines, sections 14C 1 through 9, regarding the requirements of a technical report, basically. So these are just some basic report requirements. So anytime you write up the results of a validation study, such as a job analysis, you want to include all of these different these numbers here, 1 through 9.
Yeah. And whenever you do anything with your selection processes, you always want to document what you did and why, and who participated. So in the future, so you can replicate it in the future, or also if someone, an auditing agency, comes in and says, well, why do you have this BQ of an associate's degree in accounting? How did you get there? You can go back and show them, here's the technical report, and here's how we got to this point.
All right, this slide visually depicts what a content validation is. So basically, you have the duties performed on the job up in the left-hand side there. And then, so in blue, you have the knowledge, skills, and abilities required to perform the job. And then the selection devices are designed to sample one or more of the duties and or KSAs. And so that overlap is ultimately content validity. When you have that overlap and it's demonstrated in the study that you carried out and documented in your technical report, you have content validation evidence to support your selection procedures.
So overall, this is thanks for bearing with us here and for being with us during this time. Overall, we have some summaries and recommendations. So you want to do a periodic review of your BQs. And in reviewing your BQs, you need to evaluate the disparity analysis. Look, do your BQs have disparate impact? If so, and even if they don't, you still want to demonstrate the job relatedness of your BQs.
Yeah, and you want to analyze each of your BQs separately, not just your BQs in general, because you want to evaluate which one may be problematic and whatnot. You want to be able to support all of them. Any one of them that you use, you want to support it.
Yeah, so if you have a BQ of must have a high school degree, and you also have a BQ of must be able to lift at least 40 pounds, you want to track those separately to know, okay, we're not losing applicants on the high school degree, we're losing applicants on the ability to lift 40 pounds. So you can know exactly which BQ is, like Jason said, is causing the issue. And here's some helpful resources. On the Internet Applicant Rule, the Federal Uniform Guidelines, some U.S. Department of Labor Testing and Assessment. It's just an employer's guide to good practices. A couple books. And this last one is that journal article we referenced. This was a process that a public agency, government agency went through to develop basic qualifications that resulted in federal court approval. So some resources for you to take a look at. So thanks for listening. We appreciate it.
Great. Thank you. So once again, very, very informative presentation. So we will go through the Q&A parts right now. But thanks again for a great presentation. So as you know, within this realm of OFCCP compliance and regulatory compliance, in the recruitment process, there are multiple things, right? One is some of the service that we provide to make sure all your jobs and job postings reach diverse audiences to maximize your recruiting funnel. But then there are issues regarding selection process. So today's webinar was around that selection process and creating qualification so that you are managing that selection in a way that does not give any sort of perceived discrimination or bias. And also there is a third area that we focus on is pay equity. So when we try to organize these webinars, we try to focus on these three areas. we had around recruiting. This one is about selection. We also had a couple on the pay area. So we try to give you an overall sort of overview of the processes. There are different elements. Some of the services we provide, some of them are provided by our partners, but we want to make sure that you are in the know. One of the things about, before we go to Q&A, I want to make sure that we obviously won't have enough time to answer all the questions, but you can send us the questions by mail, and our contact information is there at the end of the presentation. This presentation will also be made available to you. We'll also make available the recording. So everybody can get this, because obviously it will take some time. It's very technical in nature, so it will need some time to digest. So you can do that. And Jason and Clinton are also going to be available to answer any questions. So with that in the background, let's see if there are any questions. So there is a question from Gina, and Clinton, can you see that?
Yes, we can see that.
Okay, so can you take that right now?
To include, so if you use an assessment.
So the question, just if you can repeat the question. So the question is.
From Gina, right?
Right.
Yeah, so if you use an assessment post a phone screen, is it still considered a BQ? And whether or not, would you include those individuals in your analysis so technically they should be considered an internet applicant? If you use an assessment post a phone screen, then yes, I don't know if I would consider that a BQ, because it would depend on what is in your phone screen, I guess.
Yeah, it sounds like a test or a PPT that you'd want to track.
And a PPT, we say, the practice, procedure, or test. BQs are usually more like straightforward. Like I said, it's a certain education, training. So if you're doing the assessment itself, like you say, it's a written multiple choice test, that's not typically a BQ. That's a separate test.
But you would consider them in your analysis for that particular procedure you're carrying out on the phone, I would say.
Yeah, and you would want to track that, though.
Yeah.
So hopefully that answered your question.
There is another question after that. That was, how can specified job title have different levels of BQ?
Okay. So ultimately, the specific job title would end up with one BQ. So what we do in the process of creating that BQ, though, is we will come up with different levels to determine which one is most appropriate. So in determining, let's say the job, going back to our accounting, it's an accounting technician role. And you would list in your potential BQs high school diploma, associate's degree in accounting, bachelor's degree in accounting. So you list those different levels during your validation process. And when you settle on, okay, our BQ is an associate's degree in accounting, that's the only thing that gets listed on your, say, job description or on your BQ. The job applicants wouldn't see all the multiple levels. You're just using that in establishing what your BQ is going to be.
Yeah, and you're doing those multiple levels in the development of them so that you don't just get accused of putting one thing in front of a job expert and they endorse it and say, yeah, that's good. So it allows them to pick the best from the list.
Okay. I don't think we'll have a lot of the time, but maybe this one, Clinton and Jason, you can answer. It's related to the BQ. So here from Ed, it says, we track all who give a test. If a candidate does not exceed 70%, they fail. Do they still count as an applicant? The test is validated.
Yes, they will still count as an applicant. So if you say it's a multiple choice test, they do not self-select out. You told them they failed and they're no longer an applicant. BQs are different. BQs, you're telling them they're no longer an applicant because they don't meet the BQ, but you don't need to count them as an applicant. But if you give, say, a written test, a personality test, and there's something where they don't get over 70% and they fail, they are still considered an applicant, and you do need to track those numbers for adverse impact to see how many pass and fail that test.
I mean, it's important to keep in mind, just track your adverse impact numbers for any procedure you use to eliminate candidates from your selection process.
Yeah, because it doesn't matter if the test is validated or not, we still need to track it for you still want to track it even if the test is validated.
Okay. I know there are some questions about, slideshow and the presentation. Obviously, they would be made available. There are some questions about, Jobfindah. I don't think that's the relevant topic for you guys here. Then there's a BQ is what is in your job posting as requirements, right? Somebody.
That's typically what you see in the requirements for the job posting are the BQs, because that's what most candidates go to look at, is those must require at least 6 years of experience in this industry, or so yes.
Okay. We've got just time for one more question, and we'll get back to when validating. How do we select? This is from Shobna Bhatnagar. When validating, how do we select job experts? Incumbents or managers?
So how do we select job experts?
Mm-hmm.
We define job experts as an individual who is thoroughly familiar with the job that typically requires in most jobs at least a year of experience in the position. And you usually want to, when selecting job experts to participate in a validation study, you would like to select a diverse group of individuals who represent, for example, if you have different shifts, different locations, gender, ethnicity, and we all typically recommend including about 20% of supervisory personnel in establishing and doing validation. But I guess as a rule of thumb, thoroughly familiar with the job and at least a year of experience with that job, whether they're supervising the job or in the position.
Okay. Good. I don't think we have a lot of time. Maybe let's just take one more question. So there is a question: is would you recommend following the same process for preferred qualifications? Because we talked about, remember, desirable, preferred, and basic. So we covered the basic qualification process. How about the preferred qualification process?
Yes. So we would recommend, I guess, a very similar process for preferred qualifications. However, with one caveat, if you're going to rank order people based on preferred qualifications, let's say you have preferred qualification of, basically you're going to rank people with more years of experience as better. So if I have 8 years of experience in the field and Jason has 15 years of experience in the field, are you going to rank him above me because he has 15 versus my 8 when, say, your preferred says 6 years? So your preferred at least 6 years of experience in the area, and I've got 8 and Jason has 15. If you're going to rank order people, the validation requirement is a little more stringent.
It's more stringent, and it's actually a lot more like a written test would be, or a work sample test. It's a lot more stringent.
But if you're going to use your preferred qualifications as a pass-fail, almost like your BQ, then yeah, you could follow a similar process.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm sorry we could not answer on some questions maybe, but if there are any, please, on the topic, send it to Jason and Clinton, or you can send it to me. I can coordinate. Once again, many thanks for joining our webinar today. As I said, there are various facets in this compliance and recruiting area. We try to cover them as much as we can do on touching on different topics. So thanks for joining, and please stay tuned for our next webinar. See you soon. Thank you. That concludes our webinar today.
All right, thank you.